The first sign is not thunder. It is the stillness that makes the gulls fall quiet, and the card players look up without knowing why. On a barrier island off the Louisiana coast, in the summer of 1856, the air pauses with a weight that feels like memory. The dance pavilion is open to the breeze on three sides. Lanterns waiting for night. Boards creaking under slippers and boots. Somewhere a violin is tuning. Farther down the sand, the surf folds onto itself in lazy slaps that seem to miss a beat. They call it Last Islandel. Isle Berni Rey. Long ribbon of sand and scrub oak. Barely 6 feet above calm tide. A summer refuge for planters and merchants escaping the heat of New Orleans and the fever of August. There is no town in the way mainlanders would call a town. There are cottages with shuttered eyes, galleries shaded by palmetto, and a hotel whose porches hold rocking chairs and gossip. The island is a long veranda between Gulf and Marsh, and every wind writes its name through the buggy sand. In the hotel lobby, a barometer the size of a clock face shows a slow drop that the clerk, superstitious and precise, writes down every hour. He licks the pencil and draws an arrow. Falling, he says to nobody. On the porch, a woman whose gowns were boxed in camphor to keep moths out of silk watches. The line of the horizon go, an enslaved boy sent from the kitchen to fetch a bucket stares north where the clouds build like a wall, black rising over green. He knows rain by smell. This is something else. He tilts his head and listens. The sound at first is like a saw far away, long strokes working through a resisting board. The excursion steamer from Brashear City What Maps will one day call Morgan City made its run this morning, stacking trunks by the steps, unloading barrels, drawing a crowd to watch it pivot in the shallow water. The wheel churned up a fish smell and the laughter of people accustomed to their comforts. It will not return tonight. It will not return for a long time. By afternoon, the heat feels like a wet coat. The oaks at the island's spine have stopped moving. The surf grows muscled, a shoulder under a sheet. The first squall arrives in a series of diagonal lines, like sewing at stitches. The water to the sky, and the sky to the roofs. Rain slashes, and then goes thin, and then comes back. In the cottages, shutters are latched with clumsy hands. Nails that have held for 10 summers are asked a question and answer badly. Someone dashes from one gallery to another with a silver-framed looking glass hugged to their chest like a baby. Another person returns to a locked box, and the papers inside. Deeds and letters scented with past lives. At the edge of the marsh, a trapper with a hat like a collapsed crown looks up and says out loud in French that this is not a thunder squall. The tide has not waited for the wind. It has come in, as if scolded. High, insistent. The path to the back bay sinks an inch, then 2, then a hand's depth under gray water that tastes like both river and sea. The heron lifts off and moves inland from a line of Spartina without flapping, carried by a wind that is not yet the main wind and still takes a breath from your mouth when you turn your head. The island was never meant for permanence. It is a shifting idea, a negotiation between sediments that came down the Mississippi and waves that refused to leave them alone. But for the last 3 summers, the wealthy of New Orleans have made it theirs. Brass bands and lawn bowling, peacock fans and lemonade sweet enough to hurt teeth, sometimes a masquerade, sometimes a sermon. They brought books and servants, and the calm confidence of people who believe the world is a thing to be arranged. Out of sight, on the mainland, cane grows. Out here, pastimes grow in the thin salt wind. Just before dusk, the barometer falls so low that the clerk forgets his ledger and curses quietly. The violin bow in the pavilion hangs for a moment on a note and refuses to come down on the next. The sea is white, farther out than anyone remembers. In the back kitchen, a woman stirs batter because the habit of making cake is stronger than the warning in her gut. Above the scrape of spoon on bowl, a deeper thrum begins the first real voice of the storm. Not in the air so much as in the floorboards and the teeth. Lamps are lit early and show their flame tips tilted hard to the south. The first gust that matters takes a hat past the porch and removes the decision to fetch it. It is followed by another that pries at the corner of a shutter and lifts it with a sound like a tongue torn from frozen iron. On the north side of the island, baywater moves toward the ridge of oaks, as if the whole marsh has stood up to walk. At the Gulf shore, waves strike with a new angle, higher, crosshatched by wind, blown into shapes that look like something dangerous leaning too close. A planter with a drink that will be called a julep one day says that the storm will pass by morning and tells a story about a gale when he was a boy that took the roof but not the bust of Napoleon from the parlor. He is talking too loud. Nobody replies. A girl who has never been anywhere without a chaperone puts her hand flat on an oak trunk and feels it shudder. Then the surge begins. It does not arrive as a cinematic wall. It comes as a hand under the door, a sudden wetness across feet, then calves, then knees. It raises flat and cold where floorboards should be. Chairs begin to move a few inches at a time with a sound like a dog scooting. Tente turn, then they bump the wall and politely stay. A fish flickers silver against a stair. The wind now has the pitch of torn canvas, through grit and water. The lantern light chunks, like a heartbeat still trying to keep time. On the Gulf side, a porch gives. It detaches with the slow courtesy of an expert thief, carrying 3 rocking chairs and the month's newspapers folded and waiting for hands that will not turn their pages. The line of oaks at the island's back announces itself with the only sound a tree can make when it must choose between bending and dying. The first glass goes with a series of chimes. A woman who has been careful all her life steps onto the wrong board, and the house explains to her that it has different plans than she does. Behind the hotel, the path to the steamer landing is a river. The southern horizon is no longer a line. It is a breeze, and it is moving. A gust takes the pavilion's roof, peels it like fruitant, carries it into the dark where it becomes a new kind of living thing. In the moment after the lanterns shiver and go dead, there is a sensation that is not silence and not sound. It is the recognition that everything this island has pretended to be is about to be corrected by the Gulf. Somewhere a bell rings twice, a signal used for dinner and now for something else. A hand knocks on a locked door and does not wait to be answered. The clerk drops the ledger in deepening water and reaches for a key ring that will unlock rooms he can no longer see. A child says, "Mama," and the answer is lost in a blow the house takes to its ribs. The sea steps into the parlor and decides it likes the taste of velvet. The island, that had been a corridor, becomes a funnel. Ween discovers edges it did not know were there and plays them like an instrument. Every gap shrieks. People who minutes ago were deciding whether to move to the inland side of the island are now deciding whether to move at all. The Gulf side and the bay side merge in a gray rush that erases the sand like chalk washed from a slate. When the floor shifts, it is not that you lose your balance, it is that the idea of balance is removed from the room. They have known storms. They have seen roofs go flying, trees split, planks from the beach cottages thrown half a mile, the bay chopped into short, mean waves that slapped at boats like the backs of angry hands. But those storms left a place to stand. This one is taking the ground itself. The island's spine, a line of scrub oaks that have made wind music for a century, takes the first ranks of people who understand there is no higher place. Fingers that have held pens and reins and parasols find bark. Men in boots and children barefooted scramble up and wrap legs around trunks. A mother lifts her child into a fork and wedges him with her own body. The bark is wet and tastes like salt. Mouths pressed to wood to avoid water. In that moment, class and summer evaporate. Only the physics of grip and weight remain. At the Hotel, water climbs the stairs like a determined guest. Carpets release bubbles as they drown. The lava's grand mirror cracks with a sound like a pistol shot and then lets go in a sheet that becomes glitter and pain. The barometer floats face down, stuck against a banister. A small, round mouth that has been telling the truth all day and is now no longer consulted. Donte hala! Door bangs open and they smell the Gulf the way you smell an animal. Up close, wet, rank, and alive. The sidewheel steamer that brought them here noses at its mooring and heaves, like a horse that wants to return to pasture and finds the gate locked. The captain, who has brought men with cards in their hats and women with sunburned noses out here all July, makes a decision that will be debated in 3 parishes for a decade. Cut loose and make for open water, or keep a makeshift ferry for the next half hour and die for it. He looks at the lines, at the angle of the surf, at a boy on the dock whose job is to hand a rope, and he sees in a grain of time the scale of all the wrong sizes. He orders the line cut. The wheel bites. The boat swings its bow toward the gray, where the Gulf puts its shoulder to the sky and walks. Half a mile down, a cottage with a gallery as deep as a promise rotates like a coin and folds along its own long axis. People inside find themselves under a ceiling that was the floor a minute ago. They do not scream. Not yet. There is a heavy, low sound. That is the house explaining gravity. A man whose name is known from the sugar leases he signs on Tuesdays pays attention to the place a nail tears his hand. He thinks his body is an affront for minding something so small now. Then the water drops an armoire onto his shoulder and he stops thinking altogether. The oaks are not tall enough. The surge eats their trunks a foot at a time. In water waist deep, then shoulder deep, then neck deep. People lift themselves with fists tied around slick limbs. Salt bites. Sand in the wind. Needles skin. A girl who has never climbed a tree climbs in at the top of the short. Strong oak looks toward the hotel and sees its facade lean the way a dancer leans too far and turns the movement into art. Only this time there is no grace and no recovery. The hotel folds in on itself, and a sigh of the wind snatches away before they can hear the end of it. The storm finds its pitch and holds it. It is a note that rattles the bridge of the nose and the bones of the inner ear. In cottages, not yet dissolved, ceiling boards flex and pop as the wind pulls the roof the way a dentist pulls a tooth that never fit. A mast of a fishing schooner, blown from its anchorage, glides into the island like a spear, dragging its hull which has become more idea than vessel. A woman in the oak with 2 children hears nails scream from their seats in the timber and speaks to the wind in a language she did not learn from her nurse. On the mainland, inty French are named parishes that face the gulf with nets and salt in their beds. The warning arrives as a wall of wind that pulls tin from sheds and the shutters off kitchens and rolls them down the street like playing cards. Sugarcane leans, then lies down neatly in one direction, as if pressed by a giant hand. In Homa, doors fling themselves open. In Thibodeau, wishes are spoken into shoulders. Farther east, in New Orleans, rain lashes up the river on an angle, and a few people at cafe tables look toward the south, and then arrange their faces into practiced indifference, because a storm is a thing to be considered privately. Back on Last Island, a man who has never touched another man's hand in public without formality wraps his fingers around the wrist of a stranger, and the stranger takes it because the tree will not keep 2 unless the 2 believe they are one. Boards begin to scud past square, fast, knife edges. The last person who believed the pavilion's posts would hold learns by touch that they are gone. Lamps underwater glow a moment, saintly, and then go out with the dim grace of dying fish. The steamer's captain makes his run through white and black in a field of debris that knocks on the hull like grief, asking to be let in. He crosses a bar he's crossed 100 times and cannot find the bottom with a lead line because the bottom has moved. He looks at a compass and then at the sky and sees nothing he can use in either place. He orders the boiler banked and the bow into the waves. At a moment he hoped not to meet, a breaker taller than any that belongs in the Gulf of Mexico rizzers. Cool Edby wind, and introduces itself not to the bow, but to the side, folding the vessel in a single shelf. What happens next will leave questions in 2 parishes. For 2 generations, some will call it a lie that anyone survived the steamer. Others will hold their tongues because the dead will not be improved by argument. The island begins to separate. It was always a thin thing. Now, in the violent arithmetic of surge and scour, low places are washed deeper. Sand moves like grain through a torn sack. At one place the oaks find their roots aired in daylight, and then gone. What had been a narrow road between colonies of prickly pear becomes water, salt and black, and then sky touches sky where land had been an hour ago. It will, in a few hours more, be a chain of names: Trinity, Raccoon, Whiskey, Eastbutt. Right now it is an act, the Gulf writing its will, in a script of green and brown and foam. There is an instant when the people clinging to the last island think the wind cannot get stronger. The wind disagrees. They recognize in the animal part of themselves that this storm is not an error, not a bad interval they can home through. It is a reorganization. Above the roar, a voice carries in a pure line from one oak to another. A voice that will not be remembered by name and will be remembered by what it said. "Ho," it says, once. "Hold." There is a pause, as if the storm has left the room. Then the tide lifts the words and tears them into salt. By midnight, time is a single sound laid flat over a black world. The island is submerged. The difference between Gulf and Bay is academic, a matter for maps, and the only map that matters now is in the fingers, wrapped around wood. People who never imagined a night outdoors beyond a veranda spend one on a tree that grows only 10 paces from the sea. The water lifts them, lowers them, lifts them. A slow, indecent dance of inches. The force of the gulf is not theatrical here. It is mechanical, patient, and enormous. Surge carries furniture that becomes battering rams, beams that become levers, barrels that become wrecking balls. Live oaks, do what? Live oaks, do accept the insult. Bend, refuse to break, until they cannot refuse any longer. When they go like sentences cut off mid. People go with them into a chaos that is half water and half house. The night swallows names whole, and some will not be spoken again except in lists that will be found later. Copied in careful hands across paper that smells like damp and iron. The storm at its heart is clean a pressure drop. Wind spirals, the unavoidable math of a heated world. But to humans it is dirty. The water is mud and silt and the leavings of kitchens. It is the odor of fish and lamp oil and latrines torn free. It is snakes washed loose from their preferences, and rats, and floating pickets, and a piano that plays a low, absurd note when a wave lifts it and drops it again. A woman who last week argued the price of gloves is now refusing a floating corpse with her shoulder as gently as if she were taking her leave at a ball. Far away on Lake Pontchartrain, the wind pushes water over shorelines and into neighborhoods that did not buy houses there to hear the lake in their parlors. In the city, a church bell peals once where it should not, and people stay in their beds, because what can they do with that information at this hour? In the cane country, men walk into their fields with lanterns to see how far the damage will go, and the lanterns are whipped flat and go out in a way that makes them think for a moment they have been struck from the inside. On Dazlan, some survive in the way that animals survive, sure, fellow feeling strength. 2 men and a woman who have never spoken now assign each other tasks without conference. One holds the belt cinched around the trunk above their heads. Another puts an arm around a waist when the grip fails for a moment and the body slides into the warm, heavy water. The third watches the horizon, though. There is no horizon. Says when the gust is easing so they can breathe between the swats of rain. They can talk much. Their mouths fill with weather. Elsewhere, there are moments of completion. A man, an old soldier, puts his hand where his beard meets his neck and feels the pulse, and tells himself 1 more hour, as if he can bargain. He hears a sound he thought was thunder and understands, in a corner of his mind that still thinks of tools and timbers, that it is not thunder but a cottage meeting a cottage, and making the sound the houses make when they discover each other late in life, and too close. The steamer, if she is afloat, is nowhere near here. A piece of paddle floats past with gold paint still on it. The script of her name turned to a question. Toward the marsh, a skiff with one or spins and goes into some scrub. And the people in the tree, the skiff pass, do not speak because there is no way to get from tree to skiff. And the fact that the skiff is empty and whole is not kindness. The people think of the boy who would have pulled on that, or imagine his arm muscles, the twists at the waist, and then they stop. The island begins to learn its new shape in the dark. A sound from the east that is not wind and not wave makes itself known in the way the air changes against skin. It is the sound of water crossing through where sand has always teased it back. A new pass is Kuta, future line on a chart. A name for fishermen's sons to repeat. A place for a tide to quicken and change color. The act of making it drowns a family on a floor that has no room number anymore, and a man on a horse who thought a horse could make sense of water like this. Inside the cottages. Nothing is inside. Walls or suggestions. The piano that was playing low has stopped. It has sunk in the softening planks and become something else. A black rectangle in brown water drifting slow as sleep. The kitchen, which was a geography of order salt crock here. Coffee grinder that has dissolved into a stew you might recognize in the dark by touch but not by place. Knife, bowl. The leg of a chair. The head of a doll with one eye only. Wind eats voices. Rain polishes the last of the varnish from the parlor chairs. Trovtis. There are lines thrown that hold. In an oak, a girl who will later learn to read with her left hand because her right is not as strong, says steady. Steady save it breathe to a boy whose breath is a torn thing. In another tree, a man recites a psalm under his breath, and the rhythm of the wind makes it a kind of song without melody. Someone far down the island sings too. and nobody will ever be able to say if it was a drunk or a saint, but the sound moves like a string between trees, and for the minute that it exists, everyone who receives it is braver. The eye does not come. It is not that kind of kindness. The center passes somewhere else, and the island receives no slack rope of sudden calm and blue sky trickery. There is only the steady, grinding fact of surge and gale. The tide on the bay side and the gulf side disrespects the idea of sides and builds another foot, then two. The oaks that still stand look shorter only because the sea is taller. A woman counting spaces between thunderclaps misunderstands that thunder has been replaced by generatorless darkness and structureless sound. Time changes shape again, sometime before dawn. The wind backs a degree, a nuance only the oak leaves notice first. The rain's grain, altus fata drops, heavier, less drifty sail. Between gusts, there is the smallest of less. The kind of relief that would not warrant a mention on an ordinary day, and tonight feels like a hand at the back. People are exhausted past what the body is designed for. To hold on for 6 hours is one story. To change your grip for a 7th is a new one. Hands cramp, teeth chatter such that names are mispronounced and then forgotten. When the light finally begins, not daylight, not yet. But an argument with Darga, the first thing seen is not the hotel, not the cottages, not the pavilion, because none are there to be seen. It is open water where the road ran. It is a lean of piled timber against a trunk with human angles among it. It is, most of all, the line of the gulf, heaped like a smoldering wall, and beyond it a copper sky that has the strange look storms leave behind, that is as beautiful as it is wicked. From the mainland marsh, from wharves up the bayous, from Brashear City itself, the men who will make rescues untie lines and speak aloud to boats in family names. They have been in storms. They understand the math of waves as you would a neighbor's moods. This one is different, but they have a skiff and a sloop and a pirogue in their own lungs. They lift anchors into boats to save time later. They look once at wives who do not say wait, and they go. On the shattered island, those who have survived face a new problem. More modern, more human than wind. How to be seen. A woman who has bled from a dozen places finds the energy to pull a shawl from a tangle and wave it from a branch. A boy whistles through his teeth the way he did to call a dog, and hears the sound unspool into nothing. The people with voices left shout names, because to shout the name of a person who will not answer is to attempt to make a person out of the water. The storm is not finished, but it has stopped screaming. It blows now like something tired, angry still, but not with the black focus of midnight. It leaves behind it a geography redrafted while people were in the margins. In the low break of first day, an entire resort to a summer's confidence from a city built on water's top been taken down to its studs, and then the studs have been thrown into the gulf like straws. Someone in an oak sees a boat. He does not believe it yet. He shuts his eyes to protect the sight from the rest of the scene, in case he is wrong. He opens them again. The boat is closer now. A shape that is exactly what shape hope wears in a country where water is both road and enemy. He licks salt from his lips to find his voice and argues air into the word. Here, he says, and the wind takes the top of the word away and leaves enough. Erre, erre. They come in the morning because dawn is when you can measure a coast you have not slept on. The first skiff approaches like a lie, and then is not a lie. A man with a pole and a man with an R. And nothing else but 2 lengths of rope slide past a half-drowned live oak, and a wall of what the wall used to hold. They do not look long at the dead. They are not numb, but they have a list written on their nerves. Living first, then bearing witness. In the tree, a woman whose hands look dipped in like coughs, and spots them and makes a sound that is not a word, and is not an animal. The skiff nurse is closer, and they rescue her calloused, sun-browned. Eyes so tired they look already a day later. Hold, as if this were instruction and not the whole night's story. They hook arms under shoulders, they cut belts, they pry fingers from bark that do not want to let go because to let go feels like dying. In Aniar 3, a boy refuses to release a branch until someone puts his sister into the boat first. Then he lets go of the island and drops and is tackled by relief. They ferry to a place that can be called shore only by courtesy. It is a shape a foot above the waterline, less wet than the space next to it, with a single palmetto that is more rumor than tree. They deposit 3, return, fetch 4. The skiff rides low. Another boat arrives, then a third. The men do not say much. They count, and in counting, they begin the making of a record that will never be complete. They think about the tide and the bar they will have to cross, and the west wind shifting, and the way a plank behaves when placed between a limb and a hull and bearing weight you cannot measure without being cruel. News runs the opposite way, inland, faster than it should in a world of horses and wet paper. By midday, in Houma, in Thibodaux, in Donaldsonville, in New Orleans itself, words spill. Last island is gone. There is a particular look a face gets when a whole place has been taken away. It is different from the look for a person taken. People who had planned to go down next week to take the air and see friends will not. Those who went early will be measured instead by other numbers. On the island the dead have the decency of quiet. They lie in the wreck as if this had been their bed and someone had drawn covers up too, their shoulder blades, and left the rest to whether rescue turns to retrieval and retrieval turns, as the sun climbs and makes the smell of the Gulf a different color, into the old human work of goodbyes, sorted into piles by urgency and possibility. Men tie rope around ankles and pull bodies from tangles with the gentleness that comes only when something else has made all the decisions. Someone says names. Someone else says numbers because there are too many to hold by name. A child asks if the ocean will give back what it took and is told, by the wrong person at the wrong time, yes. A schooner works along the new pass cut by the storm, her captain reading the color of the water like a letter unfolded at last. He looks for current smoothing over new depth, and finds it. He looks for boil around submerged rubble and finds that, too. He calls out depth and angle to a helmsman who talks to the wheel with both hands. They bring the vessel's shadow over places no keel has ever passed, and drop anchor on an island not 20 hours old. The men from Brashear City throw ladders and lines, and a prayer without a church attached. At the site of the hotel, there is no hotel. There is a smear of splinters and a scatter of heavier beams that lay like ribs after the meat is cooked away. In the line of trees where people waited in the night, there are gaps where trees are absent, even as stumps. Torn out whole with root and thrown back into the Gulf, where they'll become reefs for fish whose names are jokes, told among men who work with their hands. A woman sitting on a door-turned raft sucks water from a soaked handkerchief and stares at nothing. When touched, she starts and then offers the handkerchief to the rescuer because this is how she lived before the storm she shared and. The body has not yet learned any new manners. Word reaches the mainland of a steamer lost. There is no name on the broad rumor, only the knowledge of a white wake seen at the wrong hour, and the absence of a whistle where there should be sound. Men at the dock mouth the names of boats like a prayer chain. The Star, the Island City. The Mail, the answers, are guesses. The truth will shake itself out over days, then fix like sediment at the bottom of a jar. Some made it, some did not. Survivors will step ashore in the wrong towns at the wrong hours, with stories that do not have beginnings because beginnings were taken from them by a wave. And a third of the story is a sensation of breathlessness, and would slick under the hand. The rescuers walk the new strand, shoes slipping on what was last week the foundation of a cottage. They call in French and English and the pieces in between that this coast uses to talk about weather and women in boats. Hey, they call. Halabus answer. Haponji. From beyond a litter of shingles, a voice answers in a sensible tone as if from a parlor. I am here, it says. I will wait. They cut through a tangle with axes. The smell lifts and rises and does not leave. In the tangle is a woman with a twisted foot and a boy sleeping with his head in her lap whose hair is dried in stiff ridges, made by saute-leafed bought. She cries at the angle her foot takes, and then stops because she has other work. She says, "Did you see my sister?" The rescuer, truthful in habit and manner, says, "I saw many," and leaves the sentence where it can be finished later by someone else's kindness. In New Orleans, shopkeepers push rain from thresholds with brooms. A longshatra, a newsboy who cannot yet pronounce the name Dournier, gets most of the letters and none of the cents and sells out his stack. Because the whole city knows already and wants to hold a piece of what it knows in hand. A doctor fills a satchel and borrows a horse. A priest does the same and borrows a Bible in Spanish because the one in French is not with him and the one in English is gone. People set kettles and do not yet understand that no matter how much water they boil, this will not be enough for the thirst that is coming. Toward evening, The wind has gone down to a busy murmur, like a big household cleaning up after a party. Through it, the birds return in a few wild, low flights, cutting across the low sky with the recklessness their bodies understand to be right after a storm. The rescuers keep at it under a light the Gulf makes of its own sun spilt into dirty gold through a curtain of cloud. On the back of an upturned wardrobe, a line appears at dark, mark where the water stood at noonan. This is a first fact among 100 myths that will collect like barnacles on this day. No one uses the word forever, but they feel it the alteredness. The men in boats speak to each other in numbers and angles and the names of landmarks. Only the landmarks have changed, and the numbers will need to be recalculated. And they are not prepared for that, any more than they were prepared for the weight of a single wet girl handed down from a tree. They ferry the living in and the dead out until the light goes mean and the gulf reminds them it has not forgotten how to be cruel. There are voices still, thin as saws, caught in piles and in middle-distance space, where the wreck rearranges itself with every small wave. The men line the boats and make plans for nighting. A world so changed, their plans are simple. Tie to whatever will hold, sleep in shirts, wake at the first difference in wind, begin again. In the half-dark, the island breathes in a new rhythm, even as the counting has not finished. Even as the tide under the raft the woman sits on drops an inch, and then an inch again. Somewhere, under the sighing of what remains, a place in the sand where a child used to draw the letter S to stand for sea, is 10 feet lower and filling with wrack. The last act will not be dramatic. It'll be the slow inventory of loss, and the faster, awkward blossoming of memory as people understand that what was their summer world is not just taken, but replaced with an older thing that gulfs blunt. Truth returned to the surface at last. The storm stays in the body longer than it stays in the sky. In the days after, what wind remains comes from ordinary directions, and yet people lean as if bracing. Rescue becomes recovery. Recovery becomes record. Boats pile up at Brashear City with their cargo of spared faces and covered shapes. The platform at the wharf, its boards dark from salt and new grief, holds families who made it and families who did not, standing side by side because there is nowhere else to stand. Count, begin. The numbers will slide in and out of newspapers like fish. 200 dead, some say. 300, others swear. The counting complete. Bakers who can count on water, those who kept the ledgers, are gone. Those who could have argued the arithmetic speak through second tongues. What everyone agrees on is simpler than the list of names. The island did not survive as an island. The storm took last island and broke it into a string isle, Sterney, Res 4, and then 5 pieces. Separated by passes, the tide will tease wider. The hotel is no more. The pavilions are splinters. The cottages are a memory you can cut your hand on if you are not careful. From New Orleans come doctors and priests, and from the bayous come men with knives for ropes and women with broths and cloths. The injuries are simple and old hypothermia, which has no name yet for most. Lungs full of the Gulf. Gashes that salt will keep angry until they heal like rope burns. Deaths follow rescues, as they do in disasters. Someone saved from a tree dies of fever a week later. Another who seemed unhurt does not wake on the second night because the body is a ledger that hides its debts. There is kindness. To the kind so plain it does not demand a place in a report. A fisherman giving up the only dry shirt he has to a woman who would have been served by him a week ago. An enslaved cook from the mainland feeding a planter's child with his own spoon. Grave and careful, because a child is a child and the storm did not ask the walk of anyone's life before it chose them. Stories coalesce the way dew does, in beads, then in the wetness. That means it has happened everywhere at once. A horse swam, carrying 2.5, and made land with 1. A man floated on a door with a silver crucifix and will not know if it was the wood or the cross that kept him up. A woman tied a baby to herself with a sash and lived long enough to unfasten the knot and hand the infant up into someone else's hands before she let herself close her eyes. At the parish seats, scribes make lists of the dead, lists of those saved, and lists of properties that will need the law to sort them because their owners have gone where the law cannot follow. Newspapers give the storm a name. The last island hurricane and a place in a column. Weeks later, a man in a city will read that name while the ink is still wet and decide to write a book. And decades later, a writer with a foreign name, Lafcadio Hearn, will craft a fiction called Sita, a memory of last island, to hold in art what fact cannot carry without spilling. plantations inland mourn their own and send wagons of cane to port because seasons do not stop for storms. And this is a lesson nobody asked to learn. Downriver, at the salt edge of the world, the Isles Derniers begin to do what barrier islands always do after they are broken. They shift, they lower, they let go. The Gulf takes bites and deposits them elsewhere as shoals. Maps redraw. Charts get notes in the margins. The pass here is new. The depth there is shallower. The lightship will be moved when there is a lightship to move. The fishermen memorize this with their boaties. People who could afford to summer on a barrier island will not return to that one. Last Island is abandoned as a place for leisure. It returns to birds and storms and the thin, tough things that grow in salt and sand, glasswort, marché, myths. Other islands along the coast will take up that human work Grand Isle of Orleans until storms teach their own lessons again. Farther down the years, a storm name for a saint will take Chinyarkamina. A century and a half later, names like Katrina and Ida will brand themselves into the same coast like hot irons. The language of harm will change: storm, surge, subsidence. Levees risk maps, but the sensation of the wind in the bones will be the same made thing. There are quieter aftermaths. A child who cried and did not stop crying in the night of the storm grows into a woman who keeps her shoes by the door every August, no matter where she lives. A man who thought himself unafraid of God sits in the back pew and does not ask for anything. He just sits, because he has had his fill of requests that cannot be met. An enslaved boy who watched the sky go green and thought it meant the world had expressed its true opinion runs at night 2 months later along a bayou path and does not stop until he is in a place a little more like free. The storm taught him that the earth changes shape. He believes a person can, too. What survives besides people are the ways people decide to prepare. On maps, in offices with long tables, men will draw lines to mark the reach of the water that night and argue haughtily, then use those drawings twice in a lifetime when they think about where to put houses and where to leave the wild to its own devices. Engineers will talk about how sand moves under long storms and how barrier islands are not walls but doors that can be shut only for a while. The parish constables will hire men to patrol the new passes, 2 waves storm-blind fishermen off bars that do not yet have names. Years later, a person standing on a beach that did not exist. When the storm came, will pick up a fragment of blue and white porcelain and rub the salt from it and think it had always been there. In fact, it came from a cupboard in a cottage where a woman counted plates and wrote meals into a ledger that dissolved in an hour. In a few places, trees will grow where there were none, their seeds carried in the stomachs of birds that had waited in the lee of whatever remained. In others, water will take any root that presumes to try and hold. The dead are buried a mile inland under trees that did not hear the wind the way the oaks did. Some are named in rows, others carry the name unknown because a storm takes not only breath, but the tags that attach one person to another in the eyes of the living. A marker will stand praising the courage of rescuers. Another will, decades later, mention the storm and the day and the loss in language that has become polite with time. People will visit in good weather and try to feel what it was like. They will not. People will visit in bad weather and turn their cars around. You could try to build a sermon from this about wealth on sand, about arrogance, about the folly of summering on an island made to wander. You could make it about class and race, and the ways a storm erases a few minutes of difference, and then read it again at once on the mainland, where the lists sort people back into their columns. You could make it about geology and the plain labor of the Gulf. All of these would be true and insufficient. What is true enough to end on is this. There was a day when an American island ceased to be one. A storm, not given a first name, but known by its last work, took most of a place and many of its people. It is forgotten because that is how the coast keeps moving forward. Memory slips like sand through tied fingers, but it is remembered in a dozen small habits, in weather eyes cast south in August, in stories told in kitchens about a grandmother who stopped wearing pale colors because she could not stand to see watermarks. The storm that no one survived is a headline meant to be sold on a corner. The truer sentence is that the island did not survive as it had called itself, and the idea of safety that came with the word summer did not survive either. People did, and the coasts did, and the way coasts do unevenly, with scars you can name and others that belong to a silence passed down in families. And this is what the Gulf will do again, as sea rises and heat loads wind, as the maps are revised, as towns hold festivals and swear their love for the water that will come to their doors in a year that has already been named for some other thing. The lesson, if there is one we can carry without dropping it, is not to expect mercy from the sea or malice, either. Expect force. Expect memory to betray and warning to save, and the work of preparing to matter exactly as much as the work of surviving on the day itself. A century and a half later, on a narrow islet named from the same broken ribbon, crews stack sacks against a tide that does not listen. Pelicans lift slow off posts, a boat noses in with diesel cough, and men in bright vests. They're doing the same work the skiff men did with poles and rope, holding a shape against a patient ocean. The names have changed. The oil is new. The rope is synthetic. The barometer is digital. And still, the act is an old one faced a gulf. Fix what can be fixed. Count what cannot. Carry who can be carried. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.